The question that this film shall answer is which country suffered the most as a result of the blockades during World War I? This film will argue that despite the fact that Britain was nearly driven to submission by Germany's aggressive U-boat blockade, it was ultimately Germany who suffered the most as a result of this confrontation. By November 1914, within several months of the outbreak of war, Britain announced their plans to stifle Germany's food imports through a stealthy, cautious blockade that did not rely on stationing itself closely along Germany's coast. It took Germany until 1917 before they made an all-out attempt to suffocate Britain with a vicious blockade that caused riots and terrible famine across the nation. Germany's blockade was, to begin with, very successful. Two-thirds of Britain's food supplies came from overseas, and the British found the blockade very difficult to cope with. Germany were persistently destroying every merchant ship they found around Britain. In one single month in 1917, 371 British merchant ships and 500,000 tons of shipping were sunk by German U-boats. However, Britain managed to cope with the blockade very well. Government propaganda encouraged people to grow their own food and join the Women's Land Army. And by the end of 1917, there were over 1 million allotments across Britain. The nation was not fast to introduce rationing, but it did eventually become compulsory in April of 1918. Finally, when the convoy system was put in place, which is where large groups of merchant ships with armed escorts set off all at once to throw the Germans off, the destruction of ships by the Germans dropped sharply, and Britain was able to import more. When the USA finally declared war on Germany, British food woes were considerably relieved. Germany, on the other hand, had to suffer a blockade for 5 years, since it was not lifted until they had signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The British blockade was also very successful. It is believed that as few as 642 merchant ships may have reached Germany throughout the whole war. The sharp drop in food supplies across the country resulted in skyrocketing food prices that had doubled in 1914 alone. Harvests suffered due to the lack of men on the farms, and many foodstuffs were replaced with substitutes. Kriegsbrot was poor quality bread made with potatoes and rye flour that was nearly black in colour. However, many of these substitutes were not nearly as nutritious as their counterparts. The food was so bad and so expensive that the average adult in Germany was getting on average barely a half of the amount of calories per day that were recommended for good health. The famine reached its peak in the winter of 1917, nicknamed the Turnip Winter, where the supply of potatoes in the country ran out and the Germans had no choice but to center their diet on turnips, traditionally only used to feed livestock. These various factors eventually led to the deaths from malnutrition of 700,000 German civilians over the course of the blockade. However, food was not the only issue. The surrender of Romania cut off Germany's oil supplies, which injured their war effort considerably. Without the materials to produce munitions, the German soldiers could not continue their campaign. Essentially, the blockade did in fact contribute hugely to the German armistice in 1918. The USA was barely affected by these naval standoffs throughout the war. The country was largely self-sufficient, which is one of the reasons for the differences between British and American propaganda, with the British government urging the public to grow their own food when the Americans had only to remind their people not to waste it or eat too much meat. The draining effect that the blockades had on the European economy may also have been a deciding factor in the USA's return to isolationism, since the Americans had little to glean from trading with the wounded Britain and Germany in terms of food and resource supplies. After the war, Britain's economic hardships led them to losing their title of the world's banker. However, this had less to do with the hardships caused by the blockades than it did with Britain's military expenditure and their huge loans that they had taken from the USA during the war. On the other hand, Germany's suffering on the home front during the war harmed their economy, which was a contributing factor to their defaults on reparation payments. The defaults on the payments led to the Ruhr invasion in 1921, which in turn led to the hyperinflation crisis in 1923, which in turn led to the announcement of the Dawes Plan in 1924, which in turn led to the massive collapse of Germany's economy with the Wall Street crash in 1929. The depression that came after that was one of the primary factors that led to Hitler's uprising. Therefore, as we can see, this chain reaction that began with the economic difficulties contributed to by the blockades eventually led to some of the darkest times in Germany's history. In conclusion, as I stated at the beginning of this film, Germany suffered the most as a result of the blockades. Germany's surrender in 1918 may even have had more to do with the blockades as it did with their military progress, as even though Britain was suffering and close to surrender, Germany had already suffered enough on the home front and could not continue when they could not even feed their country or build ammunition and armaments. Had Germany dealt with the blockades better, they may have been able to continue the war for longer and broken out of the stalemate between themselves and the Allies, especially when one considers that when the war ended, the German soldiers were closer to Paris on the Western Front than ever before. But the distress on the home front was too much to bear for the country, and they had to admit defeat.